Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to CLIS Social Studies. So if you're following my videos in Secession for the Classroom, you have just covered the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is how the government or how delegates were going to count the population for representation. That was the key. If you had more representatives, you had more legislative control. But as I ended the video, I told you there was a portion of the civilization or portion of the population that we had to figure out what we were going to do. How were slaves going to be represented? And now the delegates thought that they had solved this issue with the Three-Fifths Compromise in 1787. All right, so we discussed how the southern states felt about counting their slaves when it came to representation for the delegates in their states. They wanted to count the slave population as people. Now, the northern states responded with a notion that if the southern states wanted to count their slave population for people as representation, then they would have no problems with counting them for taxation purposes either. Well, not exactly. During the Constitutional Convention, there were a plethora of negotiations and compromises when creating our government. The battle for representation of delegates and the representation of people for taxation purposes held a very similar cause: slavery. How was the slave population going to be affected in the counting for representation and for taxation? Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise was all about trying to solve the dilemma of counting slaves for representation and for taxation, or you could say representation for taxation. This was a vigorous battle between the abolitionist North and slave-holding Southern states. Northern states wanted to count all the slaves for the purposes of taxation, and the Southern states wanted to count none of them because, according to the slave-holding states, slaves were considered property and not people, so they could not be taxed. So there were many different opinions thrown into the mix about how to count the number of slaves. The North stated the slaves should be counted as 5/5 of a person, and Southern states voted it down. Slave-holding states countered offer with a lower number, which was voted down again. Tensions were high at this point in time. So here's what both sides agreed on. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution states, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." Did you catch that? 3/5 of all other persons. This meant that only 3/5 of the slaves would be counted for representation and taxes. Now, there are many different ways that historians look back at this compromise. 3/5 of all slaves are counted. Does that mean that each slave was only worth 3/5 of a person? Or 3/5 of the slaves counted as a person, but 2/5 of the slaves counted as not being a person at all? The debate is in the air, but that doesn't matter. At some point in the Constitution, a slave was not counted as a person. What does all of this mean? The idea of the Three-Fifths Compromise is that for every 5 slaves, only 3 of them would be counted for the basis of representation and taxation. In small accounts, that number doesn't seem like it would make a difference. For every 10 slaves, 6 would count. However, on a larger scale, for every 500,000 slaves, 200,000 of them are not accounted for, not even seen as a person in the eyes of the government. So as you saw, the word slave was never actually used in the compromise. The passing of the 13th and 14th Amendments superseded the Three-Fifths Compromise. However, those words are still embedded in our Constitution today. I'll see you next time.